and welcome back to the Power of Youth podcast. This is episode 6 and today we will be discussing foreign aid. Last episode we discussed social media and its impact on youth. If you missed it, make sure you go and check it out and come back here. As always, I'm joined by Alex and Alannah for today's episode.
Hello.
Hello.
So to start with foreign aid, for those who maybe are unfamiliar with the topic, it's defined as money, food or other resources given or lent by one country to another. And I think to start with, let's look at Australia's impact and what Australia is currently using foreign aid and how it's spending it.
Yeah, so in 2019 to 2020, the foreign aid budget was $4 billion. $1.4 billion went to the Pacific region, so our neighbours. $1 billion went to Southeast and East Asia, $250 million to South and West Asia, $200 million to the Middle East and Africa, $55 million to Gender Equality Fund, and interestingly, $200 million went to climate change, so helping produce infrastructure in other countries and help them reduce their carbon emissions and stuff, which I found really interesting, honestly. Also, from our total budget, that $4 billion equates to around 0.2% of our total spending, which is really interesting because a lot of people don't know how much we spend on foreign aid, and a lot of people think we spend way too much on foreign aid and think we should cut down. So an interesting poll in 2011 found, asked surveyors what percentage of the budget they thought went to foreign aid, and the average estimate was 16% of our total budget, and almost a third thought around 20%. And they also said how much we should cut down on spending, and they said we should cut it down to 12%, which is already so much more than we actually do spend.
Yeah, it just shows how the media has completely skewed the representation of Australia's foreign aid to have such a large figure, 12%, which when you think about it, is a tenth of our budget. That's actually an enormous amount of money to spend overseas, when in reality we're spending 0.2%. It's a shocking difference.
And it's being cut every year too, it goes down.
Yeah,
so it's just going to continue to fall.
And that's a reflection of the skewed representation of foreign aid, that the public want it to go down because they don't actually understand how much we're actually giving.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that mentality comes from something I believe is quite understandable and I would sort of align with, and that at the end of the day, one's country's interests should be put first, and that the vast majority of funding should be funneled into infrastructure, education, healthcare, whatnot, in the country that money was generated in. And I think it's an interesting reaction that people seem to, a lot of people seem to dislike the idea of foreign aid and believe it's something close to 16%, that's a ridiculous amount of money spent on other countries. And that, they don't look at other things military spending and things like that. So in 2018, the government commissioned the creation of 72 brand new fighter jets, which cost $14 billion to make all up. And it's strange because it was made during a time of relative peace, and most of them will probably never see active action. Yet there is very little focus. A lot of that's not viewed as a waste. Whereas 0.21%, even if people aren't aware of that stat, is viewed as a waste.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing with military spending as well, in comparison to foreign aid, is that foreign aid can actually stop issues before our military needs to get involved. You look at places like Papua New Guinea, where some of our aid goes, and the investment in education there actually helps to stop the radicalisation of young youth who could then come to Australia and create more problems and more issues through their either terrorist behaviour or just more violent nature, and how that foreign aid actually stops it before any military is required at all.
Yeah, a big buzzword right now I think is national, two words, is national security. And whilst the obvious front for national security is a big, powerful military, something like foreign aid can, as you pointed out, can do more. You can help stabilise unstable countries that could potentially threaten Australia, and even by giving, say, foreign aid to a country that might threaten Australia in the future, that's going to establish a good rapport with them. You know, they've gone, well, this country is willing to help us when we need it. Why would we then ever want to vex them?
Yeah, in the media, it's not really focused upon that foreign aid is beneficial to our nation. Like you said, we may become allies in future conflicts. And also, as they advance, we may have prosperous trading agreements with them. And also another thing with national security is the spread of infectious disease. So if you provide healthcare and assistance to nations with infectious diseases, it will prevent it spreading to Australia as well.
Yeah, that was the exact same thing with Papua New Guinea, that they wanted to stop the spread of disease through into the top of Australia. And that's been effective so far in that it hasn't spread as much. I think, for me personally, I relate foreign aid to this concept of almost buying luxury goods. Is that for someone who's stable, has a house, has a car, has a family, has all that they need to survive and even, you know, thrive in some areas, to then go and buy luxury goods, it's kind of a waste. I don't really see its importance. For some people, it's this huge thing and to be able to show off. And I think it's similar for foreign aid in the sense that we want to protect ourselves and focus on ourselves, but we are stable. We have all that we need. We are thriving, and that we don't need to go and spend other things like military spending, and that money can actually be used for other people and for other purposes.
Yeah, another really interesting thing is the poorest people of our country are still living lavish lifestyles compared to the poorest people in other developing nations. And people in our country, the poorest people in our country, still have access to government services and funds, and charities also do a lot to assist these people. So people in other countries are struggling far worse, and I feel like if we spend some of our money on them, it would be more beneficial to us.
Yeah, even the bottom line in Australia, I would be opposed to using some of that money on assisting them and helping them to build up. But because of the wealth divide that we have in Australia at the moment, it's that money just isn't going to the people who need it most to be able to build up. It's going to the high income earners who just keep on rising, while the poorer suburbs and communities just keep on getting poorer. And yeah, I wouldn't be opposed to then some of our foreign aid then being used to help Australia and those people out. If people wanted to be focused on us, let's actually help the people who need it in our country as opposed to other people.
Well, then what do we think? Do we think we should be? Do you think the 0.2%, the $4 billion that we spend, is a good amount, or should it be increased to a larger margin? It doesn't have to be much more, but should it be increased?
I think it definitely needs to be increased to some degree. You see Sweden, theirs is 1.1%, the UK is 0.7%. I think we are lagging behind in that regard, that other countries are spending more and using their foreign aid more effectively. So I think it definitely does need to be increased.
Yeah, I think it's a team effort. Like, if every country puts in money to help developing nations, they are going to develop faster, and soon enough we'll have a whole world that is developed and everyone's trading with each other and everyone's friends, hopefully.
Yeah, and I think another good thing about foreign aid is, especially in our modern contemporary setting, we are in a very globalization has happened, and countries that don't then participate in the global community tend to suffer. Like, the very, very extreme example is somewhere like North Korea, which have gone, no, we don't want anything to do with anyone, and they've suffered for it. And foreign aid is a good way of demonstrating that I'm willing to cooperate with that international community. I'm willing to be open to the interconnectedness of our contemporary society, rather than just, no, it's all about me, because that doesn't make you any friends at the end of the day. Like the kid who, I hate to say it, but like the kid who never talks to anyone at school and is always insular and doesn't want to interact will struggle making friends, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. I think the other thing with foreign aid is that when it's brought up, people often say that we want to support our own economy, and that's a common response. But we see an example with Australia's connections with Africa is that Africa's GDP has more than tripled, and Australia's trade with the continent has grown by about 6% annually over the past decade due to its aid influence. And it's all about that trading and building connections, as you just stated. It enables that to work better. You build good relations with countries, and that's what it's all about. We've even seen in recent weeks that having good relations is so much more important than having those tense battles, that it's more beneficial for everyone involved.
Yeah, the media has really failed in pushing this perspective because everyone's views is we should look after our backyard first, and no one's actually realising that what we are doing is beneficial to Australia in trading agreements, in making allies, and in like stopping diseases. And just developing other nations, how is that harmful to us? Our nation is already at a high level of development. We have enough infrastructure, as you said. So it's the morally correct thing to do, to provide assistance to other nations that need the money to develop.
Well, a big issue then that I think we should talk about is how much can you then trust these certain nations that we are giving money to? Because a massive argument against foreign aid I've seen is that, well, there's a lot of countries that we provide this funding to that have systemically corrupt governments where the pretty much 100% of that aid given to them will end up in the pockets of politicians and the wealthy class of that country, rather than actually going towards any of the programs and or economic structures that they promised they would. So, how is that avoidable? Do we have to then be more selective with who we give our foreign aid to, or do we have to start putting restrictions on how that aid can be spent? So what is the way that I think that can be combated? Because again, I think that's a really big and good argument against the use of foreign aid
Yeah, definitely. Especially in the UK, they've spent a lot of aid in Pakistan. There's been a multitude of reports that aid has been given to the top dogs in Pakistan due to the corruption, and it hasn't actually been funded through to the areas that need it most. I think my perspective is to be able to put that foreign aid through non-governmental organisations, I think would be the most effective way to make sure that actual tangible action and results occur in these countries. Organisations such as World Vision, through Australian aid, have been able to do things like provide safe access to water for 87,000 people in Sri Lanka, allow 2.5 million children to enrol in school in Afghanistan, a 25% increase in the number of trained midwives in Fiji. It's giving that money to those organisations so that they can excel in their goals, because that is what their job is to do. That would be my idea.
Yeah, well, while I've been researching, I found this perspective a lot that you've brought up, Alex, and this was affirmed by journalist Anthony Lowenstein, who was involved in the documentary Disaster Capitalism, which was about the dark side of moneymakers and aid exploiters in Afghanistan, Haiti, and Papua New Guinea. And he says, it's not a call to stop aid, it's to make it smarter aid, more targeted and more engaged aid with locals on the ground. As we've seen in Haiti, Afghanistan, and Papua New Guinea, aid is not actually helping the people it claims to be helping. So yeah, I agree with you, Simeon. We should really put it into organisations that we know are doing the work on the ground, instead of funneling it through possibly corrupt governments and it going directly to government officials, and life doesn't get better for ordinary citizens.
The one issue I could see with doing it through non-government organisations is the issue of, state sovereignty and things like that, and that there are countries that that for one reason or another, don't like foreign interference in their just daily going-ons, and they are really restrictive with what an NGO can do, and they really don't. They give them very little freedom to operate as they will. However, then a lot of those countries, unfortunately, then prove to be the ones that, if you then give the government money directly, the money is then lost. So and it goes to the politicians or the rich business people in that nation.
Yeah, I think the other issue with foreign aid, which is important to consider, is this idea of dependency, and that if a country is consistently receiving aid from someone, is that it creates this safety net or idea of a safety net where they feel like they can always be dependent on this money coming in and they don't have to be as careful or watchful, and it doesn't allow them to rebuild by themselves and to really grow as a nation. And I think it's definitely something to consider.
I think that is that can be a double-edged sword as well, that dependency. There will be at times where say Australia, we're giving aid to a developing third world country, and we without intention make that country dependent on us, and then when we feel as if we can start cutting back, that country then suffers. And then the other end of the sword could be exploitation. So say another situation could be Australia intentionally creates a dependency in a country through foreign aid, so that we can then get a really strong political foothold in it. That's what China is doing a lot. I think even you'd be surprised, there's a lot of it happening in poor African nations. Chinese companies are providing foreign aid through setting up factories and creating work, and slowly but surely trying to build up an economic dependency from these countries so that they can't break away from the Chinese economy.
Mm-hmm.
And that the Chinese economy has a massive impact on what they do. Therefore, China has incredible influence in the goings-on of that country.
Yeah, there's even the idea that when that aid becomes so much, countries can begin to interfere with governing, as you said, which is a concern and definitely a worry, because then that aid isn't really achieving its goal of being able to support the people who need it most. I think then we have to ask the question, well, what's the most effective way to provide aid? Is it directly through the country into their economy? Is it through NGOs? Is it through our own aid agency? Do we create our own system and then go and send it through to make sure it's direct?
That's true. I think we should split it up and do some to the country itself, some to world organisations, and some through our own agencies, just so that we know at least it's helping in one area or another, instead of just funneling it through one and just hoping it goes to somewhere that needs it.
For me, it's if you are going to give a country foreign aid, and if they are willing to accept it, I think they do need to maybe accept, when it comes to the spending of that money, that they should expect a little bit of maybe foreign interference, and that can be something incredibly minor, like an Australian diplomat going to the government and requesting, can I see the projects, can I see the schools that are being built with this money, can I see the facilities where the vaccinations are being carried out. It doesn't have to be like an Australian company then comes in, does the building and leaves, because that at the end is just not beneficial for anyone. It's more a system of accountability, I guess. Like, we would like to know that this money is actually being spent responsibly and is being spent where you have promised it will be.
Yeah. I also want to look at the refugee crisis quickly, because I think it's another interesting point with foreign aid, and especially in Australia and other Western nations, the idea of accepting refugees has been pushed back by the media and by the public and by the government. It's been a big no-no that we can't accept in lots of refugees due to issues of violence and terrorism and taking jobs and money and all this stuff, which has been just ramped up by the media as this huge thing. I think the other option, if people don't want to accept refugees, is that then we increase our foreign aid in those places. Mm-hmm. That countries which are currently housing refugees, such as Uganda, is currently one of the largest houses of refugees. There's lots of refugee camps, but just can't support. They can't support 2 million people in a country which can't even support its own population. To then go and invest in that country to build structures and services to be able to support the refugee population, I think that would be another option to solving that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't actually realise that refugees are not going to wealthy countries. Most refugees,
Oh, yeah.
about the only real country that actually has the capability of supporting a massive refugee population, and that is supporting a massive refugee population, is Turkey. And even still, they are struggling with it.
Yeah.
That they don't have it 100% down pat.
Yeah,
You know,
and there was Germany as well, which tried and they failed.
Letting
it
in
was
a
not
couple.
successful.
It was not a successful experiment that they did. So, yeah, I think if we're going to be so anti-refugee in this country, then instead of just saying no, we don't want them, you should probably be asking the question of, we don't exactly want them, but what's a way that we can ensure that they don't want to come here? And I'm totally against the notion that we should not welcome refugees into this country. But if that's the unfortunate stance that the majority of Australians seem to have taken, then you need to then look at, well, what are the alternatives? Because it's morally reprehensible to then just say, well, we'll just leave them either A, in the countries that they are going to get persecuted or killed in, or B, in a country that can hardly support them. Countries that can't support their own population, let alone an extra 1 million people.
Yeah, well, it's definitely better for everyone if refugees don't come to Australia and choose to stay in their own country. But they're obviously coming over here for a reason, and we should look at what the root of the problem is, and then go to those countries and improve the conditions so that they can stay in their nation where they have the same culture. Your nation, you want to stay there. They obviously don't want to leave, but the conditions are so poor that they have to. So if we develop all these countries, then there is no need for people to want to seek refuge.
Yeah, I think with foreign aid and the refugees as well, I would love the message to be, these people need help, let's help them.
Yeah.
I'd love that to be the message. Obviously, it's just not going to fully sell, so we have to go with the message, we need to help them to help us. And it's as a self-centered message, and it's not one that I completely agree with, but I think it's the only way that we can strive to support other nations if we don't want to just help them because of their need.
Mm. Yeah, it's just not the altruistic perspective, it's also because it is beneficial for our country in the future. And why not? Let's help people and they can help us.
But then also you're looping back around, maybe there's a lot of these refugees fleeing these countries because there's corruption.
Exactly.
And so then that also just then brings us back to the core of the issue. How can we assure that foreign aid is being spent in these countries responsibly? Because I hate to stereotype, I would say that you probably couldn't really trust a country, say like Syria, whose regime is notoriously corrupt, with foreign aid.
Yeah, well,
without
it's a tricky one, and especially the countries who are then supporting them are the ones that are looking for political influence and political advantage in that country. I'm not sure if it's the UK or US, but one of them is providing foreign aid to Syria and using those connections in the Middle East, which is a very volatile and also valuable strategic resource for many nations to gain influence there. Do I think that's a bad thing? Yes and no. It all depends on how that influence is used. If they're supporting local communities and their goal is to gain influence, I still look at the fact that they're supporting others. But if then they're using that influence to incite violence, to create more conflict, to anger the local governments, which then causes retaliation, then I think it's not effective.
We'll look at, say, Russia's involvement in Syria. I don't know the actual statistics, but I dare say their biggest contribution to foreign aid in Syria is military, in that they support the continuation of the Assad regime. That could be considered a foreign aid contribution.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how we can completely determine where it's being spent. If there's a way that we can have an international sort of standard. There was one idea where people spent money according to their wealth. So, the more wealthy countries spent more money to others, and that was one
Just like
idea.
tax.
Yeah,
A bit.
obviously we have lots of issues there, but even if we had some sort of international system where money could be spread and it's done through people on the ground, I think that's the most important bit.
Yeah.
To have people on the ground spending this money. As soon as you've got money in the hands of people in power, it's hard to know where it goes, especially in countries where it's often by authoritarian regimes. That money can go somewhere and no one will ever know where it went to. So I think having people on the ground using it is the most important.
Even in a democratic country, like say Australia, who we're notoriously tight with our money, even in democratic countries, it's hard to know where that money is going to get spent because I think democratic countries are usually notoriously quite tight with their money. So yeah, it's a really difficult. I like what you said there, Simeon. You need people there on the ground actually spending that money rather than just going, here's a nice big check.
Yeah.
These are the things we'd like you to do with it.
Yeah.
Don't know if you are going to do it, but I think there needs to be some sort of way that not necessarily accountability with punishment, but just general transparency of we want this money to be spent here, and we want to see it being spent there. Like that's why we are making this investment.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good idea to have an organisation for the whole world to pool their money into one spot and then divide it amongst nations so that every nation gets a bit of money at least, and then it can go towards people who really need it. And like you said, we need people on the ground because we don't know where the money's going in some corrupt nation.
Yeah, and you don't buy a house without taking a tour of it first.
Yeah.
Like, you want to know that it's an investment.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it might sound a bit cynical saying this, but it's a business investment, and you want to know that that investment is going towards something beneficial and is a good, solid investment.
Yeah, it's a shame those are the words that we have to use, but that's where we are now, and we've got such. Just our statistics are so out of whack as a population. Those are the words that we have to use to get this point across.
Yeah.
I think another aspect of foreign aid, which is a bit controversial, is this idea of tied aid, where I say, I'll give you money, but you need to spend some of that money on buying our products.
I believe the core of foreign aid should be just the fact of goodwill in that we are helping one another because, we're all humans and whatnot. I think that's kind of contrary to the point. I'm not someone who believes that. I don't do favours for people in the belief that they are then in debt to me. I don't believe that's if that's the way you function, then you're going to live a very cynical, sad life, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I just don't think that's a good way to build relationships of, we've done something for you, now you have to do something for me. And we're going to get very cross if you don't do that something for me.
Yeah, well, I don't understand the difference of giving them $1 million and saying you have to spend $20 million on our vegetables. Why don't we just give them $80 million and give them $20 million of our vegetables?
Yeah, true.
Yeah,
I'm not opposed to tied aid if we say, just to make the numbers round, if we give them 100 million, say you have to spend 5 million on our products. Sure, that's fine. We want some sort of advantage as well. It's going to be impossible to get to a point where we're just giving all this money away. So I understand that point.
And it also provides transparency. At least we know at least some of it went to buying products that are beneficial to the nation.
Yeah, there's this cool thing here where every additional dollar spent on Australian foreign aid in Asia has resulted in $7.10 in Australian exports. So it's just a huge impact and increase in our own exports from our aid. So I think that part we're doing well. That investment part, that growth of our sales, we're doing well. It's just ensuring that we are also committing to supporting the people that really need this money most.
Very true.
I just want to end on this quote, which I really like about foreign aid. and it states that the purpose of foreign aid is to end the need for its existence. And I think that should be how we are functioning now, that we want to give this aid so that we don't need to do it anymore.
Yeah.
So that we can help nations and ensure that they can stand on their own 2 feet and do it properly.
Yeah. Well, our nation is so beneficial because we only started 100 years ago. So we came into this, 200 years ago, into the creation of this country with an idea of how to run it, set up infrastructure. But all these other nations have been there for thousands of years and have evolved. So they haven't set up the same infrastructure and stuff that we just started.
That we started with.
Yeah, because we started with a plan. Like, they didn't start with a plan.
A lot of these other countries as well are only very recent creations. Like, somewhere like most African countries don't really hold that much significance historically. They're literally just colonial boundaries.
That's right.
Whereas,
say, like Australia, our whole country's just one big island.
And like, where did we get all our money to begin with?
We got
From England.
From the
British.
British.
So we started off requiring foreign aid anyway. So now that we're at a position that we can provide foreign aid to other nations, why shouldn't we be doing that?
Yeah, exactly.
There we go. Anyway, thank you for joining us for episode 6 of the Power of Youth podcast. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you have any other topics you'd like us to discuss, please let us know in the comments below or through any of our social media. Please join us next week where we'll be discussing the cost of living. Thank you very much.
Thank you.